The big topic on the agenda today is the local elections in the North. Who's up, who's down, who's in and who's out, and what it means for the balance of power in our towns and cities and that levelling up agenda. I'm sitting at home in Leeds at 9 a.m. on a drizzly Friday morning, currently trying to get my head around a flurry of overnight results from the north of England, places like Hull, Salford, Grimsby, Newcastle and Hartlepool. We've had more than a dozen councils declare their results so far in the north of England, which means that as things stand, there are still several dozen more to be declared and hundreds more northern councillors to be elected. But we can still have a good go at working out what the results we have so far might mean. And we've got a great guest to do it with too, Zoe Billingham, Director of the IPPR North think tank. Zoe, welcome.
Good morning, Rob. Great to be here.
Very nice to have you on, as always. So, looking, as always, the caveat with these elections, isn't it, is that we won't know the full picture until maybe tea time or even towards the evening because of the way the results are spread out. But, there's already a bit of a trend emerging, isn't there, in terms of Labour doing well, the Conservatives losing seats, which I guess is what we would have expected. What are the results? What's your interpretation of what we've seen so far?
Yeah, I think that's right, Rob. So from what we've seen so far of the results coming in, they're kind of broadly in line with what pollsters were predicting going into this election, with large losses, a prediction of up to 1,000 seats for the Conservatives lost, and those gains falling mainly to Labour, but also, of course, we will probably see gains for the Liberal Democrats, Greens, and perhaps some independents too. So that balance of both who loses, but then who is gaining will be really important for who gets overall control of the 230 councils that are up for grabs today. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. And of course, the councillors that we're seeing up for election, the last time most of them were up for election was 2019. We've seen how many prime ministers since then? 4 prime ministers. So for a lot of people,
a whole another lifetime ago, doesn't it, from a political point of view?
Exactly. So for a lot of people, their kind of local leadership will be the most stable political leadership that they've got close to them. So that's adds to why, again, this election's a really interesting one, and especially a year out from a general.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak's been out already this morning and sort of trying to temper any criticism about the losses that the Conservatives had made. And obviously, it needs to be pointed out that the Conservatives were starting from a low base, having done quite badly in 2019. But he told broadcasters today he was not detecting any massive groundswell of movement towards the Labour Party or excitement for its agenda, despite the opposition gains. But there have been a few sort of notable results. So let's go through some of the highlights in Northern England. So perhaps the one that most interested me is that there is a new mayor of Middlesbrough. Chris Cook has beaten Andy Preston, who is a independent mayor, former city trader. So he will be the mayor of Middlesbrough with a swing of almost 20%, which is... You have to distinguish between someone who's the mayor of a council, like Andy Preston is, and with someone like Ben Houchen, who is a metro mayor, who has very different types of powers. But I think it's an interesting example of the sort of perhaps change in dynamic on Teesside, which is a big area of interest. Bolton is going to go to no overall control. It was led by the Conservatives, but Labour are going to become the biggest party. So we'll wait to see whether they take over the leadership as well. Labour also now the biggest party on Hartlepool Council, but 1 seat short of an overall majority. In Hull, interestingly, it's a very different dynamic. Labour were trying to wrestle back control of Hull Council from the Liberal Democrats, but they did not do so. In fact, their result got worse, and the Lib Dems, who were leading Hull Council, have now tightened their grip on it. A couple of other sort of headlines in Sheffield. We haven't got the result yet, but the leader of Sheffield Council is apparently standing down. Labour's Terry Fox, and Labour in Sheffield are in all kinds of trouble. They're in a pretty dire position because of various scandals. So we'll see how that unfolds over the day. Any particular for you, Zoe, any particular results in the North that sort of give us an idea about what the public is thinking on levelling up, maybe, or give us a clue as to how the next general election might work out?
Well, firstly, just on levelling up, I think it's fair to say that the general public, as well as local councillors, are feeling pretty sceptical about whether the government's really committed still to that agenda, albeit it's still crucially important and very high when the public are polled about what they care about. And in fact, some recent polling done by the New Statesman showed that 71% of Conservative councillors felt that the White Hole knows best mentality still rules the roost. So that's both scepticism from the Labour and the Conservative side. But just stepping back a minute and just reflecting on some of those results you were just speaking about, Rob, I think firstly, the kind of Middlesbrough mayoral result is an interesting one because, of course, the incumbent was an independent. And I think that's something we're going to see today that's going to be really interesting, which is a switch from independents potentially back into parties. Going into this election, when we look at the stock of councillor seats, there are more independent councillors than there are Liberal Democrats. And that could be something that really shifts in this election. I think thinking about the whole dynamic you picked out between kind of Lib Dems and Labour is interesting, isn't it? Because the sort of wider commentariat always talk about, you know, the blue wall in the south, which is Lib Dems versus Conservatives broadly. That's what, you know, people are referring to. And then in the north, people think about the red wall, which is, you know, Labour versus Conservatives. But of course, that doesn't hold true. Dynamic as whole is showing us that actually when Labour and Lib Dems go head to head, there's a whole new dynamic going on there. And then just thirdly, on Sheffield, of course, Sheffield Council is still very much suffering from the impact of the tree felling campaign that started some years ago, but resulted in a kind of takeover of the council at a recent election. So it just shows that whilst I know a lot of people will be looking for the kind of general election trends out of today's results, you know, hyper-local issues can totally dominate local campaigns and totally shift results. And of course, people don't always vote the same locally as they do at a general election anyway, particularly given our current voting system.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it's worth pointing out, actually, that in a couple of councils in the northeast, Sunderland and South Tyneside, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, respectively, have now moved to be the main opposition in those councils. And actually, across the north, I've done a bit of number crunching. The Lib Dems have gained 7 seats so far. And like you say, independents have lost out. 9 independent councillors have lost their seats. Labour have gained 30 seats in the councils we've seen so far, and the Conservatives minus 23. I think a lot of attention in terms of levelling up is going to be on Teesside, because as we've previously noted, it's an area where the impact, for good or ill, of the government's levelling up policies, if you think about free ports and, you know, moving the headquarters of the Treasury up to Darlington, those are the places where it's most obvious. So I think it's Teesside where people will be sort of looking most carefully for the results. And actually, I've had a senior Conservative who messaged me about what's happened on Teesside, and he was saying that, I'm just looking at my WhatsApp messages now, in Middlesbrough, this person was surprised that Andy Preston didn't hold on to the mayoralty, but actually questioning whether this was such a big win for Labour, since Middlesbrough has been largely under Labour control since it was created in the 1970s. And obviously, while Hartlepool, Labour have made some gains, is it a great result that they haven't actually managed to take full control of the council and only moved into no overall control? Speaking of Hartlepool, we've got a voice note now to bring you, a little dispatch from the Hartlepool local elections. Nick Marco, who's the local democracy reporter for Hartlepool, has been at the count overnight, and he has filed this little account for us.
In the Hartlepool Borough Council local elections, where 1/3 of the 36 seats on the local authority were up for grabs, it was a good night for Labour, who celebrated becoming the biggest party on the council. However, they remain 1 seat short of the 19 needed for an overall majority. Labour won 9 out of the 12 available seats in the latest local polls, making gains in 5 wards, and 2 of those seats were gained directly from Conservatives. The Conservatives themselves had success in a tightly contested poll in the Hart ward. There was 2 recounts, which resulted in their candidate, Rob Darby, having 2 votes more than the Labour candidate, and that ultimately was the difference between Labour holding an overall majority or being left on 18 seats as they are. The Conservatives, they also retain the seat in Rural West, where their group leader Mike Young was re-elected. In terms of reaction, Labour said they were proud of the results they've had, and their first job is to be fighting to be in control of the council for the coming municipal year. The Conservatives, they admitted it was a disappointing result, but they pointed to how in recent years, with the council under the control of a Conservative and Independent coalition, they've secured tens of £millions of investment into the town centre, and they want to continue to be pushing that regeneration, whether they're in power or not. It will be at the annual general meeting later this month where it will be decided who will be ruling the council for the coming year.
So that is Nick Marco, who's a reporter in Hartlepool. There's one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Zoe, which is the impact of voter ID on proceedings. Obviously, these local elections are the first in the history of this country where you are required to bring some item of photographic ID to be able to vote. And if you don't have an item of photographic ID, you can bring a special certificate that you can apply for from the government. And I see the government has been out this morning saying that, all the elections went well and there were no major issues. But anecdotally, around the north, there are quite a few incidents I've been hearing about people being turned away from polling stations, residents in tears because they didn't know they had to bring ID and then not being able to vote. I mean, we won't know the full extent of it until the full numbers come in. But I mean, what's your view on that?
I mean, the requirement now for voter ID, and of course, this is the first election we've had since this has become a requirement, and it will be a requirement at the general election in the same way. Has been called a solution with no problem. When we look at the extent of voter fraud in this country, it's incredibly low, and so, as you say, the kind of ramifications of having to bring ID, people being turned away, people being disenfranchised. We've also heard reports of people leaving their ID at voter polling stations. All of this stuff, I just think we could end up with a bigger problem than the problem that apparently we were trying to fix, if that makes sense. So I hope that the extent to which people have been turned away or not been able to vote is being properly recorded so we can see the full impact of this on the other side of the count. Because frankly, as I say, there could be more problems stemming from the requirement of voter ID than there were ever in the first place.
Absolutely. And in terms of what we've got for the rest of the day, hopefully this podcast will go out around lunchtime and there's still dozens of elections still to happen. Are there any you're particularly looking out for? For me, I think Darlington will be really interesting. The other places in Teesside as well. I mean, are any particularly on your radar?
Yeah, I think that's right. Darlington's got to be a key one, particularly given the sort of optics of that being in the Chancellor, indeed the Prime Minister's patch. Redcar, Cleveland, Stockton, these are key ones to watch on Teesside for sure. I think in Liverpool, where I'm speaking to you from, I don't think there'll be any surprises here. Although there has been a lot of work and campaigning from smaller parties trying to chip at Labour's dominance here. So, I think an interesting set of results, and look forward to seeing what comes for the rest of the day.
Absolutely. Well, we'll all be glued to the TV and our mobile phones as always, and Twitter to keep out for the results. Zoe Billingham, thank you so much.
A pleasure. Thank you, Rob.